Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be doing the second Overwatch League 2021 roster breakdown analysis video, and today we'll be talking about the 2022 seed, the team with the second best overall differential in record in the Overwatch League for 2020, and that is the Philadelphia Fusion. Despite the fact that they didn't win any tournaments throughout the regular season or in the playoffs, they were still the team that ended up with the second best win rate in the league based on the fact that they only had 2 losses as opposed to the 3-loss Shock team. So, let's jump into this Fusion roster and give you my thoughts on this team and where they stack up with their 2020 campaign. This team is very different from the one that we saw in 2020. A number of players no longer with this team: Boombox, Chipsa, Sato, Fury, Ivy, Hisu. An entire starting lineup, essentially, in terms of the number of players, not exactly positionally, that are no longer with this team. So it's a team that underwent some major changes, and I think this team is going to look very different this season than what we saw last season. To start, I want to talk about the support line. It is the one spot on this roster that is completely unchanged, minus the departure of Boombox. Funny Astro and Alarm. Alarm, the reigning Rookie of the Year and a support role star for 2020. Funny Astro, a very, very good main support for this team in 2020 as well. A very good couple of players here for the support line. A very strong back line. One of the most impressive backlines in the league, so a very good-looking team here. And I think this is a very nice-looking core to kind of build this team around if you're going to hold on to 2 pieces from 2020 to kind of be your mainstay that you aren't going to touch at all. This is kind of what I would expect. I thought these two were both very good. Funny Astro especially impressed me later in the season. They were subbing him out a lot at some point in the season for like Brig BAP comps, where they put Alarm on the Brig and they'd bring in Boombox to play the BAP. But as the season progressed, we saw more Funny Astro kind of stay in and play. I think it was Brig is what he would play usually, and they'd put Alarm on the BAP. So I think this is a really strong support line. I can't say much more good things about it because they were very good last season. They were one of the top support lines in the league, in my opinion, last season, and I think they are still going to be one of the top teams to look out for going forward, because I think they are very, very good. This duo is very good. I don't know what else to say about them. I would expect them to take another leap forward this year, an extra year of synergy, as well as, they're both relatively young players, Alarm especially, so I'm excited to see what those two do going into 2021. Moving on to the DPS line, I want to save the tank line for last. We see 2 returning pieces on this DPS line. Obviously, like I said, Ivy, Hisu, and Chipsa, though Chipsa didn't really play very much. Those 3 have departed. The remaining 2 pieces from this DPS line from last season are Carpe and EQO. And of course, they also added in the offseason Shockwave, formerly of the Vancouver Titans. But just starting with the 2 players that we have returning with Carpe and EQO. Carpe obviously had a great season last season. He was one of the favorites to win the MVP. Definitely early in the season. Not so much late in the season, but something definitely that was talked about earlier in the season. He was a damage role star. He is the first player to reach 4,000 final blows. Carpe, very good player, had a good season last season. Down the stretch, I think he started to struggle a little more. I don't know how much of that was necessarily on Carpe and how much of that was just on kind of this system that I felt was happening in Philadelphia, where it seemed like they wanted to kind of give all of their damage players, with the exception of Chipsa, a lot of playtime. I think they kind of felt like they had too many cooks in the kitchen. They were trying to please all of the different players, and it seemed kind of odd at times, like weird things happening at all. And so I think that, for me, is one of the key things I'm looking at with this team is, what do I think is going to happen with this smaller DPS line and with them holding on to two players who arguably were kind of the weak links down the stretch. Now, that feels weird to say about Carpe. A lot of people during the playoff run were kind of disappointed in Carpe. I still have a lot of faith in Carpe, and I think that there were some decisions they made down the stretch that were a little weird that didn't involve Carpe, that involved them taking Carpe out. When the Fusion beat the Shock in the final week of, or their final week of the regular season, Carpe was key to that. He was incredible in that match, and he was the big reason why the Fusion were able to beat the Shock. But the problem that remains with the Fusion and with Carpe is that Carpe has been somewhat struggling, I think, with play style more so with the rest of the team. And his Tracer especially had kind of been a little too aggressive, which I think is one of the things that Shockwave brings, is a good Tracer and another secondary hit scan player who maybe competes a little more with Carpe, pushes Carpe a little more, forces some more things to be changing with the way that Carpe plays, and his style of play may see a slight change because of the addition of Shockwave, but I'm not 100% sure. I still think Carpe is a very good player, and I think you can build around him. My bigger area of concern is with EQO, because we did not really see EQO play that much this past season. The heroes we saw him mostly play were Genji, which he looked very good on the Genji, especially in the Summer Showdown. Didn't look as good after the Summer Showdown. It started to struggle a little bit more after that, but still looked very good. And we saw him on the Echo, which he was also very good at, but they didn't run him a ton down the stretch on that. But Echo is also a hero that we saw Shockwave run a lot, and he looked very good on the Echo. He was one of the top Echoes, genuinely. So it's an odd situation with EQO, because I think down the stretch he seemed somewhat weak, and he seemed to not be the piece that they wanted. Ivy was very good for this team last season, and his Mei especially was very good, and his Hanzo was very good. These are heroes that EQO will have to be playing. His Hanzo is one of the heroes he's known for, but we barely saw him play Mei this past season, if at all, and that to me is my biggest worry with EQO. How flexible is this DPS line going to be, and is EQO strong enough to be their only flex DPS on this team? Now, it's still early. They might sign another one. There's some big names still out there. Libero, Rascal, Ding is even still out there. So they do have time still to add another flex DPS player, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did. There's a couple other positions, well, one other position in particular that I think they might add another player to that I'll talk about here in a second. But I'm interested just to see what they think they have in EQO, because as good as he's been, he was very good in 2018, 2019, a bit of a dip, and he had a bit of a resurgence at times in 2020. It didn't seem like they were happy with his performance as a whole, on a wide variety of heroes, to make him their main flex DPS player throughout the season. So I'm curious to see what happens. What I will say is one of the problems that I think, like I mentioned, that this team had last season was kind of too many cooks in the kitchen with DPS, that they had too many DPS players they were trying to give playtime to. And that's something that we saw with the coaching staff, I think, potentially being a problem. Because, as you know, their old head coach was KDG, and KDG had that problem somewhat prominently, especially so when he was with Seoul Dynasty back in 2019. There was a lot of kind of switching around. They had two rosters basically, and we saw them switch it between those two rosters a bunch, putting a player in, pulling him out, putting him in, pulling him out, stuff like that. A lot of interchangeable parts there, and the Seoul Dynasty team from 2019 never really felt like they hit their full potential, because there was just so much stuff going on between them, kind of switching between a bunch of different players. But now you have 9K, of course, the former general manager for the Paris Eternal. Before that, he was a coach with the San Francisco Shock under Krusty. So I think it's an interesting thing to note that coaching-wise, I think this is going to be a more specific and obvious culture for the coaching. And I think that we'll see less of that kind of attempts to kind of please people, and less of an attempt to kind of keep people active and trying to like balance things. I think truly what we're going to see this season with this Fusion roster is they are going to set a lineup that they like. They are going to focus on those players. They're going to put their full effort into what's the word I'm trying to think of? Improving these players, and kind of working with these players to make them as good as possible. And I think that is the key here. I think the coaching staff is very important, but I have a lot of questions about this DPS lineup and whether or not it is going to be strong enough to compete, especially when they're going to be playing in Asia. And you'll have to match up with the likes of the Hangzhou Spark and the Shanghai Dragons, even the Guangzhou Charge, who I think have a pretty good one. The Seoul Dynasty have a very strong DPS lineup. Potentially New York, they have Ivy there, very good flex DPS player. They might be over there. Chengdu's DPS lineup has been looking pretty good recently. Some of the changes they've made to that lineup looks very good. So this is going to be a tough task, potentially, for this team when you have multiple players that are not from Korea, that are not Korean at all, and that are going to be playing in Korea, living in Korea. You can run into some problems. I'm a little concerned about this DPS trio, especially with Shockwave and Carpe, two incredible talents that have been really showing out. I think this is a weird roster in that regard, and it gives me some questions about whether or not this DPS trio is truly what is needed to make this team one of the top teams in the league. Final two roles are main tank and off tank, and this to me is where I have the biggest questions. They traded for Mono in the offseason, coming over from the New York Excelsior. The big question with Mono is how is he going to perform on a mixed nationality team? He has only ever played for Korean rosters, of course playing for LW Blue, and then the NYXL and Philadelphia Fusion. A couple other teams for LW Blue, but they were all Korean teams. So he has been specifically on Korean rosters his entire career. He has not played on any rosters that were mixed. So that, for me personally, brings up a lot of questions. How well is Mono going to do? And I think a lot of people say that that's usually not a problem. Usually players kind of adjust pretty well. It's not that difficult. As long as the player is kind of like good, and they are willing to kind of embrace the challenge, they usually succeed. And I think Mono is a player who should find success. He's a very, very talented player, and I don't think that's really the problem. I'm a little concerned about the fact that this tank line is Mono and Poco. Now, like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of those situations where they add another player to this team. I think there's a very good chance that we get another flex tank on this Fusion roster. There's players like Meko still available, Janu is still available, QOQ is still available, and if you even want to go for non-Korean off tanks, McGravy is out there. So there are some other names out there that you can add to this roster that would be potentially helping boost this roster, and boosting this tank line, because we don't know how good Poco is going to be. I thought Poco was good, and the fact that he was able to compete for that starting spot at the beginning of the 2020 season when they added Fury, who is arguably the best diva in the Overwatch League and also just one of the best off tanks in general. And Poco was able to kind of split time with him at times throughout the season. I think that shows you that Poco still is very talented and still has a ton of potential as a player. And I'm not worried about Poco really being like this piece that's holding them back. I'm more so just concerned about the synergy between Mono and Poco and if they will be able to synergize very well. One of the problems I thought that New York had this past season was Mono not being kind of on the same page with his off tanks. It seemed to me like Mono very much wanted to play a certain way, and the off tanks never really followed him and agreed with him. And so I think that was a big problem New York had. I thought the problem was lessened when Bianca was in than when Hoppa was in, but it was a problem that I thought kind of hurt Mono's 2020 performance, which then going into 2021, you wonder if that is more on mono or more on the off tank, and if he can have kind of a resurgence on this roster with a very solid tank line, a solid off tank partner. How will that translate to results for this Fusion roster? Overall, I don't feel as good about this Fusion roster as what I would have last season. I thought this was a very good team last season. With the addition of 9K, I do think that provides a major boost to this team. I feel very confident in their abilities when you consider the fact that they have a very good player, or a very good coach, one of the best coaches in the Overwatch League, basically. You look at his record as a manager and the coaches that he's worked with in the past, it's a very, very, very strong coaching staff here in the Fusion. And I think it is a better coaching staff than what they had last season. The question is that going to be enough to boost this roster to new heights, especially when they're playing in a very difficult Asia region? Now, I will say the North American region this season is difficult as well. You still have the likes of the Shock from last season and the Mayhem from the last season, but also now you have the Justice and the Fuel, who have completely revamped the rosters, looking very good, as well as the Gladiators. So there is no real cakewalk in either region, but I think with the Fusion, you're going to have Poco and Shockwave and Funny Astro, EQO, these players who are not from Korea, have never lived in Korea for an extended period of time, to my knowledge. Maybe some of them played in Korea a decent bit back in like Apex and whatnot, and obviously they spent some time in Korea, Poco and EQO and Funny Astro during the Grand Finals weekend, but they weren't there that long. They were there, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. So, it's a little different when you spend 2-3 weeks there versus when you're spending months there. Potentially from April until September or October. That's a long time to be in Korea when you're not from Korea. And I think that's one of the things that I'm looking at with this team. And it concerns me a little bit. I do not expect them to be the favorite coming out of the Atlantic Conference. I think right now you have to look to the Mayhem or the Justice for that one. And in, potentially even like a dark horse team like Toronto or like New York. I think that's kind of like a 5-person race right now between those 5, with the potential for like a London or a Houston or a Paris to kind of surprise people. Even Boston could potentially surprise people, or Atlanta. I actually think has actually looked pretty good as well with the addition of Pelican. I completely forgot to mention them. So I think there's some improvement in the Atlantic Conference this season, and I think that the Fusion going to Asia is going to be difficult for them, because I think that's where they're going to be really tested more than they have been. I think it'll be better for them in the long run. I think going into 2022, or if there's like a playoffs scenario where they can kind of play in North America again or whatever, who knows. I think when these players start playing against North American opponents again, I think we'll start seeing them have some better performances, because they'll kind of be forged a bit in that Korean fire. But all in all, I think this is a very tough ask for a team that had one of the best rosters last season and one of the best records last season. It's difficult to expect this team to find a ton of success with these changes and with playing in a very unfamiliar region for some of these players. I find it decently overwhelming for a lot of these players. And I think there's a very good chance that we don't see the same success from the Fusion this season that we did last season. But at this point, only time will tell. I would love to hear your thoughts on this Fusion roster in the comments down below. Let me know if you think this roster is going to be good, weak, you think that they have the potential to be very good, whatever your thoughts are. I'd love to hear them from you down below. But that is all from me. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more content like this in the future, consider liking and subscribing, as it helps out a lot, and that way you know when I get more videos like this out to you. Yeah, that's all for me today. I hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.